Good afternoon to everyone and welcome. Thanks for being resilient throughout the day. We have been through some very nice panels today. I'm very honored to moderate the panel number 4, Identity Construction Through Difference, the second one, and would like to thank you for the invitation. So first, I'd like to thank all the presenters today for having sent your works and for being here today. Also, thanks for everyone who's listening, and we'll have the opportunity to take part in the discussion later on. Please keep this in mind while you are listening to the presentations. You may write down your questions on the chat if you want, on the Zoom chat, or you may send it directly to me so we get organized throughout the presentations. Some very important information concerning the presentations. I will ask all of the presenters to keep short and do not overlap the 15 minutes. I will let you know if we get to 15 minutes so we can save some time for the discussion. Also, for this reason, I will make the introductions very short so we can gain some time for later on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenters today. So it's a trio from Unicamp, Campinas, Brazil. We have Rafael Urano Frendlich, who is a professor for Fundamental Theory and Project at the School of Civil Engineering, Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Campinas. Together with him, co-authoring the paper are Gabriel Romero, PhD candidate, and Fernando Caviccioli, I hope I'm saying it correctly, master candidate at the same institution. So the paper is entitled The Dialectics of National and International in Oscar Niemeyer's Career on his connections in the United States of America from 1938 to 1947. So Rafael, if you please share your screen with us. If you have a presentation, the mic is yours.
Well, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to debate with colleagues of so many different parts of the world. Even so, we are going through harsh times. It's really a privilege. Oscar Niemeyer retains the position of a prominent individual figure in the 20th century Brazilian architecture. The sense of uniqueness was not sustained only on the grounds of Niemeyer's work within the scope of theory of architecture. His trajectory was guided through good dispositions, political opportunities, and favorable context. Durand and Salvatore announced the sociological contours to the enthronement of Niemeyer's persona, demarcating his social circle and how it helped to amplify the scope of his work. Quote, his career started at a young age, driven by such favorable circumstances that placed him definitely above any other Brazilian architect in terms of public visibility and professional prestige, end of quote. The state of the art of research on Niemeyer was enlarged in the last years with works such as those made by Grossman on the architect's French connections or Rossetti's studies of his work in Itamaraty, signaling the importance of his international works for the whole of his successful practice. On working considering these new contributions, we hope to establish an overall archives-based, enduring, broad, and systematic study on the ties and networks that made these international works feasible and realized, and more. We seek to explore the hypothesis that the work of Oscar Niemeyer and its recognition is part of a dialectical approach of national and international works, on creating a reputation as a Brazilian and at the same time international architect, from a dialectics in which the synthesis puts him in the condition of an architect always in transit. Before Brazil Builds exhibition in 1943, which has guided the comprehension of Brazilian architecture for the forthcoming decades, publications interested in foreign modern avant-garde gave space to Brazilian architects through the works of Rino Levi and Marcelo and Milton Roberto mainly. Levi published in French and Italian reviews the UFA National Cinemas made in São Paulo. Marcelo Roberto and his brothers had access to American editors as they publish at the headquarters of the Brazilian Press Association and the Santos Dumont Airport in architectural record. While these exchanges between the foreign press and Brazilian modern architects were starting to take place, Niemeyer had the opportunity to go to New York on behalf of the Brazilian Foreign Office to build the country's pavilion at the World's Fair. There, he established contact with modern American architects, especially Wallace Harrison and Paul Villiers. The architecture of the pavilion itself is very well studied by prior works, which we are relying on, especially those made by Euclides Macedo and Carlos Eduardo Comas. Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer made the winning entries to the competition held by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil by initiative of Costa. Both architects had teamed up to make a final version of the pavilion. What happened next, for today's standards, sounds like fantasy. As time was running short already, and to make a final version synthesized in two projects, the ministry sent Costa and Niemeyer to New York to conceive the building together, fixing the practical issues in New York. Niemeyer spent some months in the US, and some of them without the presence of Lúcio Costa. He stayed in the country until the beginning of 1939 to supervise the construction of the pavilion, a task that involves more dialogue than producing drawings, as it requires negotiations, practical discussions about money, and so on. It is certain that Niemeyer had close contacts with the architects who made the interiors of his pavilion, like Paul Lester Wiener, in addition to the show's chief architect, Wallace Harrison. These contacts were already signed to make the architect known, as they were figures linked to top executives in America, like Rockefeller Jr. And these prominent Americans had also bonds with art institutions, such as the Museum of Modern Art and its modern architectural curators, like Goodwin, Hitchcock, Johnson, and lesser known Stamo Papadaki. Niemeyer met Americans and participated in many fronts of this World Fair, which should be considered as central for his experience. Well, the pavilion itself was a success. Building had a long curved outdoor ramp that leads to an open balcony and an internal garden with aquatic species on a reflection pool. The site plan shows an even distribution of open and closed space, making it a wide open pavilion. The fair would be on show from 39 to 40s, covering all weather, and would expose the contrast between the Brazilian pavilion and the rest of the other buildings that, although some of them were modern, they were very enclosed, except perhaps for the Netherlands pavilion, which had a canopy, and the entrance and the smaller Chilean pavilion, with its large glass wall and Camilo Doris wall. But the proportion between gardens and buildings, and the open and closed space, made the Brazilian showroom to stand out. Later on Brazil Builds, Philip Goodwin would remark their quote, "There were a number of excellent modern buildings at the fair, but none was more light-heartedly elegant than the Brazilian pavilion." End of quote. As it is widely known, this comment was the tip of the iceberg. During the 40s, American circles would recognize the importance of some works with which Niemeyer was involved. In 1944, in Paul Zucker's proceedings of the event New Architecture and City Planning, Siegfried Gideon put a conference on the search for a new monumentality. Gideon wants to bring together modern architecture and monuments for the democracy. Often relegated by the avant-garde, monumentality was brought back as a question for, according to the historian, quoting, "Every period has the impulse to create symbols in the form of monuments," close quotation. Gideon shows an image of the Ministério da Educação e Saúde, without mentioning it in the text, suggesting mysteriously that the building made by Lúcio Costa's modern joint venture could be a model for the future of international monumentality. In the same direction, MoMA's curator Elizabeth Mock stated in the exhibition built in the USA that, quoting, "The democracy needs monuments. There must be occasional buildings which raise the everyday casualness of living to a higher and more ceremonial plane." End of quotation. Mock uses some American works, but mixed among the images, there appears the Brazilian pavilion with its curvy ramp. American intellectuals were interested in works of Brazilian modern architecture that had a public representative task as possible prototypes for the exaltation of democracy. If those buildings were made during Vargas' dictatorship, not exactly relevant for the American audience back then, of course. The fact is that they could be considered democratically monumental as a shift on the light-hearted opinions of Goodwin's Brazil builds. The sensible operation would qualify Niemeyer and Costa in a different rank as foreign professionals, not as official architects, which they weren't, but as architects that had a more political discourse and portfolio on the future of international modern architecture. In the meantime, Niemeyer did his homework. As the association with openly Democrat politician Juscelino Kubitschek gained enduring, Niemeyer's hegemony begins to take shape. The Church of São Francisco de Assis, unfinished at the time of the 43 exhibition, is the first modern Brazilian work that is simultaneously published in several international magazines: American Architects Journal, Progressive Architecture, the French L'Architecture, and in the Italian Stile. The success and recognition abroad was constantly used as a tool to overcome unpleasant attacks made on his work in his homeland. The Church of Pampulha itself was not sacramented until in the 40s due to petty polemics in the scope of the clergy. Brazilian Historical Heritage Preservation Institute took matters to itself, preventively listing and fundraising the restoration of the then abandoned building in a process that would be extended all the way to 1959. In the justification, the international recognition of the temple was the core argument. Quote from E. Considering the unanimous praise aroused by this work in the centers of greatest artistic and cultural responsibility through the world, particularly in Europe and the United States, we should prevent it. The end of quotation. This pendulum movement of reputational construction is revealed from its recognition abroad, which is a model for understanding the architect's career. The church gave Niemeyer momentum to be selected to join the team of notable modern architects led by Wallace Harrison, who headed the works of the 1939 fair, and to make the UN headquarters and to participate in some of the spirit that would propel his reputation internationally for good. Taking a look at this small series that stretches from the pavilion to Pampulha's church to UN headquarters project, we can see that there is a pattern that we can consider as important in this early bird condition of someone who went abroad in the end of the 30s as a Brazilian architect. He was the face of modern Brazilian architects with the special distinction of being associated with democratic monuments, which was a very intensive discussion ongoing in America after the end of the war. Two, he had a prior relationship with Wallace Harrison and a very distinctive entourage, mainly due to close connections were made during the 1939 World Fair in New York. And the widespread reach of individual works like the Church of Pampulha's project, which gave the mark of continuity of Niemeyer's role as an architect, whose raw talent stood out. In no way these factors should discredit his individual talents, rather serving to keep the always ambiguous position of Oscar Niemeyer as an autonomous figure in the actual context of contemporary architecture, simultaneously Brazilian and international, although never regionalist, monumental and democratic, iconoclast and official architect. To be this persona, he could never be in one place. He should always be in transit. Oscar Niemeyer was, of course, still an architect. His works are often taken as excellent testimonials of modern architectural trends in the tropics to such degree that one eventually gets mistaken as another. No historiographical approach has assertively scrutinized the balance between national and international reputation, which leads to blind spots on academic studies of Niemeyer. It is clear that New York's World Fair made Niemeyer an early bird, providing him privileged contacts and opportunities that helped his ingenious ideas on modern architecture to be widespread and, most importantly, to always be positioned side by side with international works. The models he found in such episodes was replicated all through this 20th century, which claims for some revision. Mainly, it is necessary to acknowledge some autonomy of Niemeyer's work from his country of origin, recognizing a new dimension of complexity on the architect's career. Such approach urges new methodological strategies that may help to capture the constellation of realities, political struggles, and how Niemeyer was part of a common effort of some traveling wanderer architects during post-war era worldwide, as foreign creators of ideologies of national affirmation mediated by global issues. Right now, our initiative bringing together Unicamp, University of Brasilia, Unifesp, and Scholar Study tries to hopefully articulate this broad international network of researchers to raise information about foreign and local archives in order to verify the size, whereabouts, and positions of Niemeyer has in different locations, seeking ways to better qualify his transit and to make an accurate argument of his dialectical approach of national and international. I would like to thank in this last minute I have Gabriel and Fernando, which are researchers doing specific archive-based studies on these matters and helped and wrote this back with me, and my young researcher Lucas Estevan, who allowed me to use this piece of Israeli paper he's studying right now. Thank you very much. I hope I made the points clear enough for us to discuss it later.
Yes, thank you very much, Rafael. Also, thank you for sticking to the time, just on the spot. Next, I'd like to call Adriana Pablos, Master Candidate in Design Studies, Urbanism, Landscape, and Ecology at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Today, she will present Adaptation, Ubiquitous, and Monofunctional Modernist Residential District. Adriana, please go on and share your presentation with us.
Hello, hola. I hope you're all doing well within this pandemic. So my name is Adriana Pablos, and I'm going to speak about a topic that I'm passionate about, which is the adaptation of residential districts. I'd like first to thank Sao Paulo's School of Architecture and Urbanism, as well as Madrid's School of Architecture for putting all this together, and because it's such an honor to be here today. And this paper is part of a research that I started back in Madrid, so at the School of Architecture in Madrid, and which I'm currently, as you said, developing within Harvard University Grad School of Design. So many thanks to all of these institutions for their support. And so without any further ado, I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, do you see the screen?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. As you know, at the start of the 20th century, the modernist residential district was a new form for collective living, responding to the mass relocation of workforce from the countryside into the new-found urban production centers. Fueled by the economic expansion of the post-war decade, so 1945, 1973, this residential districts became the most widespread manifestation of modernist architecture. And today, the first decades of the 21st century, these architectures are suffering now from physical degradation and cultural obsolescence. And against this degradation, there are two possible actions that are being deployed: demolition, one, and adaptation, another one. And each one has very different social, environmental, and cultural impacts to our societies. The social impact of demolition is problematic because it evicts existing residents, which are typically low-income and elderly people, and so discontinue their social networks. And in contrast, adaptation, by not demolishing, offers the communities a continuity. And this is key to what this research and this paper defines as adaptation. And it's that adaptation happens when the existing residents are kept in place. From an environmental perspective, the process of demolition and rebuilding is ecologically untenable since it discards usable material and energy. And culturally, we have inherited a narrative of both failure and death of these architectures, but these architectures are there, they're in the cities, they're alive. And so the amount of modernist residential districts transformations that have happened or are happening worldwide in the last quarter century evidence that they're alive and in evolution through processes of adaptation. And these adaptations, the expertise of design, assessing existing conditions and reimagining the potentials of the original structures is vital. In understanding how architects, urban designers, and landscape architects are adapting these housing structures, what stands out is that in addition to readdressing physical degradation, their adaptations are crafted to renegotiate and overcome contemporary problematics, diminishing them, such as economic pressures, demographic declines, lack of social diversity, conflicted urban spaces, and stigmatization. And these negotiations or renegotiations have, in turn, produced and established a number of spatial strategies of adaptation, namely addition, subtraction, diversification, reprogramming, camouflaging, and augmentation. To honor sort of the conference and the paper for this presentation, I will only elaborate on 4 spatial strategies of adaptation, and I'll present addition and subtraction and reprogramming and camouflaging as pairs and through the binary structure of the dual. So here you can see the before and the after of a case study of adaptation through addition. And we all know it, it's like a Basal, so you can imagine how happy I was when they got the Pritzker. But anyway, the spatial strategy of addition involves increasing a building's mass, multiplying its living surfaces, and optimizing its energy performances. So these spatial operations, in turn, augment the value of the original structure by allowing the accommodation of more tenants, the upgrade of the living conditions, and the reduction of energy costs. And this strategy enables modernist residential districts that, with time, have been unfolded into city centers to adjust to growing economic pressures while preserving their residents. The adaptation of Grand Park is laudable for proving that adaptation is cheaper than demolition and rebuilding, and for giving all stakeholders an added value. Now, for the housing company, this adaptation cost 30% less than the previously planned demolition and reconstruction, and it yields the company additional revenue through new rent incomes from the additional penthouses and the reduction of energy expenditures. And for the existing residents, it translated into additional space, additional light, additional air for their apartments without an increment in their rent. But also for local authorities, the adaptation reduced the stigmatization of the district, serving as evidence of their successful support in ameliorating the scarcity of affordable housing in the city. In contrast, the spatial strategy of subtraction reduces housing units to mitigate building vacancy. And in doing so, this strategy customizes and upgrades existing dwellings and renegotiates a new identity to the aftermath of shrinkage. This strategy allows modernist residential districts that were built to allocate workers next to sites of production, of industrial production that have been discontinued or relocated to adjust to the resulting demographic declines and economic deceleration. The adaptation of the post-socialist new town of Leinfelden has merit for making shrinkage an urban transition instead of a final state for the town. And through the operations of subtraction, this town reestablished the balance between housing and population, as well as heritage and new ideologies and new aspirations. Addition and subtraction are therefore like two opposite operations in mathematical science, and in spatial terms, they imply either the increase or the decrease of matter in an object. Confronted under a binary comparative scheme, no pattern of lakhs or spheres can be established within the modernist residential districts. It is the context that determines the operation. In fact, specific geographies do establish patterns. Now, let's talk about the second pair of strategies. The spatial strategy of reprogramming repurposes the ground level of modernist residential districts through the reassemblage of its natures, public and private interactions, and water resilience. In contrast to the modernist residential buildings, because they're so automized, the vast extension of the modernist residential district and landscape, normally comprising 75% of the footprint, serves as a broader arena towards social cohesion within the district and the city at large. And the adaptation of Unidad Vecinal San Pablo Chalpa in Mexico City is laudable for reconquering the lost publicness of the ground level with reduced means. And through participatory planning, the architect negotiated with the ground inhabitants who had appropriated the public space to enlarge their private living surfaces. They renegotiated the substitution of these fences and barriers for sheltering and programmatic horizontal ones. And in doing so, the public space transformed into a social catalyzer for all. And well, this case is quite controversial. It's in Chicago and was, in fact, my last trip before the pandemic hit. It's just in front of the IIT of MIAS. And if anyone's interested in visiting. But anyway, this case represents the spatial strategy of camouflaging, which transforms the material textures, colors, patterns, geometry, and contours of modernist residential districts' facades. These topical operations, in turn, dismantle absorbed stigmas and reshape identities by providing new aesthetics to the modernist residential districts. The strategy allows districts that were built under doctrines of cultural hierarchy and supremacy, such as colonialism or racism, as well as dismantled political projects such as communism, to disguise their invalid birth ideologies and impersonate new ones. The adaptation of Dearborn homes is laudable because, besides whether the new aesthetics reflect better or worse its community, this adaptation, which also included the renovation of the interiors and building installations, proved that if planned, it is possible to adapt public housing neighborhoods under the cost of a housing voucher here in the United States. And this is important because in this continent, there's a general understanding that adaptation is just not worthy because it's too expensive. And when confronting case studies of adaptation through reprogramming and camouflaging, the first thing that stands out is the difference between working planes. So reprogramming transforms the ground floor, whereas camouflaging repurposes the facades, the schemes of the housing blocks. Additionally, they also offer opposite capacities. In the modernist public space, if the modernist public space stands as an asset, as an opportunity for economic, for social renegotiation through densification, modernist mass housing facades have become an urgent and global problem regarding energy inefficiency. However, Both strategies hold the unique capacity of renegotiating and adjusting these districts to historical discontents and contemporary cultural aspirations. So finally, despite the critical declaration of death of modernism and modernist residential district, these architectures continue to be alive. Adaptation is happening, and it's happening globally, and it's successfully driving impact in communities. So in adaptation, designers are needed. Our role is to understand and define the potentials of housing adaptation as a vehicle for social, environmental, and cultural renegotiation of cities while preserving the most substantial working class housing resource worldwide. So thank you very much. That's all. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Adriana, Pablos, thank you very much. Thanks also for being on time, but also for the beautiful imagery and for a good presentation. So next, I would like to call Jale Sari. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I went to Google to try to learn the pronunciation.
No, it's very close.
Okay, thank you. Landscape architect from Yasa University in Turkey, currently attending a Master of Sciences program for Sustainable Architecture and Landscape Design at Politecnico di Milano. So today she will present from one Louvre to another, cultural constructs and the self through the other. So you may now share your screen and start your presentation, please.
Yeah, I am actually in Turkey at the moment, and I wish that I was able to just go there, because throughout the other presentations, my curiosity just grew much more to be in Sao Paulo and see Brazil, because it was quite interesting. My paper actually it's quite far from where you guys are. Most of you are at the moment. It's in UAE. It's actually looking into like one brand, and it's two museums. So I'm comparing the Louvre in Paris, and I'm comparing it to Paris Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi, because I was actually working there when this was constructed, and I was able to see when it's open, and I was able to see the patience and then interest growing throughout this museum. So yeah, I think maybe just like briefly catching up on like what the museums were previously is just like embodying the country's cultural capitals and then materializing the national identity. Now we have some things called like the Universal Museum, which is like, allowing their global capitals to the other countries. And then this is to say actually, so that more people can see this, the objects of interest. And then they also have like just developed this cultural exchange programs, which happen in between Paris, in Louvre, and in Abu Dhabi. And I think what's interesting to point out that like, although the notion of identity has been, changed throughout the course of these years, it somehow is still interesting in GCC countries, because if you look into this, like, the museums and the identity and then national museums since 2000, there are like many museums built around in these countries. And then, I mean, these are just to mention some of them, like the important ones to be named. And then we can see that they're just like a lot. And then basically there's what I wanted to point out with this paper, to point out there's like this case growing in this land. And then Universal Museums, actually, it's like one of them is a Universal Museum from the all other museums that I just mentioned. And it's been given to like these 10 museums in North America and then 9 museums in Europe, that they are kind of making this cultural exchange programs, which is what is like an interesting ways of doing the museum in the nowadays. And I think what's also important is that like what happened in between Louvre, Paris, and Abu Dhabi, they had this 30 years of agreement of just landing some artifacts, giving the advice to Abu Dhabi Museum, and then object loaning, just, in exchange of like $1.7 to $2 billion, which is like a lot of money. And then I think my concern here is like just to understand, the impacts of like using this brand Louvre and its like technologies of presenting and making representation in a country outside of their scope, or like in culturally actually. And then like the interest of Abu Dhabi, while they are trying to create this authentic self when they establish this museum. And then actually looking at Louvre, it's very clear, even in this very one image, like how they have an understanding of presenting and representing certain values in their own spaces. And I think like by bringing these items to display, they are giving like a very strong message to their own country, to the other, maybe their citizens as well, that, they are in reach, they have the power to control and just like bring the capacity of the countries to the best. But I think what you can see in Louvre in Abu Dhabi is like this Universal Museum team. It's very interesting, like they are bringing everything almost into this one room just to indicate that they are universal, and then they're presenting this shared themes that connects people all together, because they're very proud of being international. There's plenty of expats living in that country. So I think it's questionable when UAE trying to embrace this certain perspective in a museum under the name of universalism. And I think you can see within the same room, there are like different items just exposed and like exhibited, and then they condition to each other is like, changing a lot. So I think to understand like allowing visitors, and then what Louvre Paris may be pointing out, like, giving the artifacts a global status, and then within this status, they're also gaining like a global perspective, and then it's almost like their ideas become globalized. And then Abu Dhabi is kind of enhancing this case under the name of universalism, and then setting a precedent for the rest of the world to watch. And I think looking at the Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi, it's like a very intricate, it's like a great space to be in actually. And then the museums and then the materiality and the creation is like really significant, and it's very important how they are trying to just, communicate these ideas. And then they share some brand, like although these two museums share the same name, same brand, you can see that like the Louvre in Paris and Abu Dhabi is like completely two different things in terms of their architecture. But looking inside, you can see in Abu Dhabi Louvre's program that they have these 4 wings, and then they are almost trying to catch, because they are universal museum, these wings and these galleries kind of stretching throughout the history. They are trying to catch up with all historical periods, which is a big target. And I think while they are doing this, it's like it's kind of problematic, because they are categorizing certain things just because they are coming out from the same time. They're categorizing these artifacts just the way they look, and then it's like obviously they're contextualizing what's presented, which is very, it might be dangerous to do. And then I think like, again, what we can see in these images, like the museums aim to celebrate diversity and then encourage curiosity, becomes almost redundant. And then compared to Louvre's, what we have seen in previous image in Louvre, Paris, this nuanced collection, these objects here in Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum is like reduced to an abstract identity, just being next to each other. And then this continuous observation of the items in other objects' presence, it's also kind of like flattening their contextual backgrounds and importance within that context. So I think it is important to just like, maybe conclude actually here is like the dynamics of this centering, the perspective of Louvre Paris in Abu Dhabi is very strong, how they prioritize what to present and like how to put things together. And it's just like, making these certain ideas globalized and approved with everyone. I just wanted to highlight that one. And then I think with this paper also, it's important that like manufacturing, making these cultural agreements, it's supposedly cultural agreements, but it also becomes like an economic agreements as well. Manufacturing a global recognition through a museum is becoming something maybe popular. And that's circulating the Louvre Museum specific ideas is just maybe also kind of flagging out like a critical danger. And I think when Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum is like trying to, retell the stories of the region in a universal arena, they are kind of still depending on this very much developed idea of like westernized and like othering, and then like these agreements of cultural exchange just becoming like economical exchange, and then these models are kind of promoting like a generalization, which is might be like a critical to understand. I think that was it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we are going to move to our last presentation on this panel. So I'd like to invite Jesus Utrigues Acerete, who's currently attending the Master in Proyectos Arquitectónicos Avanzados at Universidad Politécnica de Madrid in Spain, relating to what we have also just discussed, but on a very different way of reading it. Jesus will present the work Ozone Futures Market, Insert Coin, to start playing. So Jesus, please go on and share your presentation.
It work?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marcos, for your presentation. And I'm Jesus Utrigues, and I'm doing my PhD studies at the School of Architecture of Madrid. And the title of the paper I'm going to talk about is Ozone Futures Market, Insert Coin to Start Playing. In January 2011, Helsinki City Council and the Guggenheim Foundation agreed to explore the feasibility of a new museum for the city. In November 2008, it had taken place the inauguration of the new port infrastructure in the northeast of Helsinki. It was called Uusari Harbour, and Jussi Pajunen, the mayor of Helsinki, tried to revitalize the South Harbour, the main port of the city, which is near the city center of Helsinki. From left to right, we can identify all the main characters. On the left, Jane-Galen Karela-Siren, director of the Helsinki Art Museum; Tuula Haitanen, deputy mayor of the city of Helsinki. In the middle of the group, we can identify Richard Armstrong, who is the director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation and Museum. As I previously said, next to him, the mayor of Helsinki, and on the right, it is situated Ari Weissman, deputy director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim. In June 2015, Mark Wigley, chair of the jury, announced the winning proposal of the Guggenheim Helsinki Ideas Competition. It was a project by Muro Kusunoki Architects, and this is the image of the project called Art in the City, through which we can see the view of the South Harbour. But the Guggenheim Foundation made public the participation data for the competition. There were 1,715 projects from 77 different countries. It was possible to see all of them on the website of the competition. This is a screenshot of the online gallery, a grid of 20 columns and 85 rows of images made up a huge, seemingly never-ending mosaic. From this context of our overwhelming amounts of information to be processed emerges the figure of Troy Conrad Terrien, curator of architecture and digital initiative at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. For Conrad, this was a unique opportunity to process with digital tools the enormous amount of information contributed to the competition, an architectural archive with 1,715 different ideas applied to the same city from the perspective of a common program. Troy Conrad defined it as the most architectural intelligence in our history at the precisely moment we are able to handle things like big data, an approach that implied reformulating the nature of the discipline itself. In the article that we can see in the screen, open architecture, 5 points on why we are opening the Guggenheim Helsinki competition data. Troy Conrad also explained the need to understand the contemporary digital space as a new conception of a space defined as instantaneous, light, ephemeral, intangible, and volatile, close to the notion of software, a virtual space capable of confronting its nature with the classical qualities of architecture, such as massiveness, materiality, stability, and permanence. That's the reason why Conrad wonders how my architecture enter the same space as software. In the image, we can also see these are the panels of the 1,715 projects of the Guggenheim competition stored at the former headquarters of the City Art Museum of Helsinki, and all of them had to be evaluated by a committee of experts. And I'm sure that Conrad was not satisfied with this image, with all these papers stored over there, according to his thought about light and instantaneously and all these adjectives. So Hugo Liu, data scientist, Marti Kajala, and also Troy Conrad began to use digital technology to connect all the projects in a more flexible way. It was published in the Guggenheim Helsinki Now exhibition. It included an interactive installation that made it possible to interpret the information provided by all 1,715 proposals. As part of the activities complementary to the exhibition, Troy Conrad and a small group of artists, architects, technologists, urban planners, graphic designers, and filmmakers had a debate and a reflection on the future of architecture in a world increasingly shaped by new technologies. The meeting took place in Alan, a province of Finland located off the Baltic coast. As a result of those days of retreat in the Alan Islands, on October the 23rd in 2015, the Guggenheim Foundation launched its first online exhibition, which is called Awesome Futures Market. It explored the intersection points between architecture and new technologies. On registration, each user received 10,000 coins to invest in technological innovation, which are called future, and some of them are on the top of the image. And for each investment made, the user had to share relevant information that justified the investment, and it was called hot tips. The most value news produce a fluctuation of the prices in the market. Unlike the financial world, which prioritizes currency exchange, Awesome Future Market traded information. You are entering the architecture of a new type of exhibition. This was the message you can find when you have to access to the mobile application and to the online exhibition. And Awesome Future Market had managed to free itself the materiality of the walls that used to delimit museum so that it could dissolve into the infinite fluidity of the digital world. Continent and content were dissociated. The exhibition space was no longer part of the building that had traditionally provided it with its existence. This issue appeared in the article, Ozone Future Market Inflates Expectations, Falls Short. Ana Cachillan identified the symptoms that evidenced the crisis of the profession was going through. She defined architecture not as a capital value, but performative effect, and architects not as object makers but curators. As she also says, Ozone reflects the psychology of neoliberalism, in which the aspirational fantasy of immaterial labor can be sustained only through an elaborate live-action role-play, in which one discipline adopts the trappings of another to offset the realities of its own material disenfranchisement. The exhibition, the Ozone Future Market, was also followed on Twitter, and I was to separate architecture from the problem of the building. This was a statement, and it was published by Benjamin Button, the American sociologist. On the same day that Ozone Futures Market made its appearance, Berlin-based American-born artist Daniel Keller set up an army of bots and fictitious user profiles to alter the market for his own benefit. Just 48 hours later, Keller led the ranking of the most influential users of the Ozone Future Market. And finally, on December the 13th, in 2015, the Ozone Futures Market official Twitter account announced the collapse of its servers and its inability to continue running the platform. On the right of the image, a year later, Helsinki City Council rejected the proposal for the Guggenheim Helsinki. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jesus, for your presentation. There are many, we have 4 seemingly very different presentations in terms of the subject of analysis, but I think there are also many aspects correlating your presentation. So in the very last presentation, the question of architectural production in relation to big data, information flows, networks strikes stronger in a way for me than in the other presentations. However, it also points to a thread that is now that is also very consistent with the other narratives we listened to here today, namely the idea that knowledge is built, and I quote, in transit, end quote, which Rafael brought about on the very first presentation, which is immersed in a very complex amalgam, so platforms, practices that convey exchange, that generate narrative building, and something that is worth unpacking. So that we don't get lost in translation. Willing to question how do we unpack these complexities. I think every single work of this panel does this in a very singular way. To remind us all, this year's critical conference proposed an exercise in sheer comparison, so coupling cases, comparing terms, and I quote, putting into practice the mechanism of comparison as a basic instrument for the construction of architectural culture and theory, end quote. So in applying new lenses, one allows disassembling, unpacking, unveiling new relations between things to provoke a deeper understanding of our discipline. So I'd like to keep that in mind. I would like to ask you to keep that in mind while we move to the questions. So I have some points that I would love to raise, but before that, I would like to encourage the audience to raise questions, to make comments, to react to our panelists by using the chat. Let me open my chat here so I'm aware. If somebody wants to speak, please write it up. So you might write on the general chat, or you might write direct messages to me if you want. So I will get started while we wait for this. Please do not be shy. It's a last opportunity today for this discussion. So most of you, if not all, and so I address this question to all the four of you, raise questions of institutions or established architectural practices or narratives that are colonizing the discourse and spatial production at other territories. This is something very relevant in the cross-cultural exchanges that we discussed here. So can any of you develop on this? So this idea of colonizing the discourse through the narratives in this narratives in transit that you bring about. I think this is extremely clear in Saris.
Yeah, I was gonna actually just jump in, but like I also wanted to wait a little bit. But I think for me it was clear that like there was this clear identity of Louvre, which is quite important for Paris and like even for the rest of the world. And then Abu Dhabi, like UAE, using this strategy to just gain attention to their authentic self. But it's just so contrasting for me that they are kind of, although that they have other museums as well, they have like the Zayed National Museum, which is also designed by another star architect. So they have these islands of museums and like art island, you could call it. So they have like these great museums designed by these great international architects, and then they associate their authentic values with these star names and like star lure, you know, like these museums and anything which is quite international. And I think for me it was quite complicated to understand like how do you promote something authentic while you are just accommodating everything international. So I think that's like, you know, worth considering and discussing more. That's what I could see, because it's becoming more and more common and just becoming like a more common practice in between the other countries as well to gain knowledge in the universal arena.
Thank you. Rafael, would it make sense for you to think about also the way modern architecture has been or has acquired a narrative also through the famous catalog of Silbius from the MoMA, while it offers another narrative by Oscar Niemeyer himself and something else that you try to build by investigating into other narratives that haven't been told. Does it make any sense to you?
Well, it's always a bit difficult to do an accurate statement on how these narratives were competing amongst themselves when it comes to the Museum of Modern Art, which was such a powerful apparatus to build a notion of modern since the international style, or maybe even before it. But when it comes, I feel like my paper has a lot of tangencies with necessary work, as it showed like the notion of an international architect that displaces himself and designs something in another context, and invariably this brings a lot of risks, and it takes a lot of let's say bridges to be made, and eventually those bridges are, so to speak, are built upon the materials of historical, I would say, oppressions or even colonizing postures on design. I think that the notion of Niemeyer as an architect in transit refers also to the way he used to transit. He used to travel to these countries. He lived there for a while. He connected with the network of architects of these places. We are working with Israel now. It is clear that he had a connection with a broad network of Israeli architects. It is something that when we look at the narratives that we have on Niemeyer, they usually state him as a very powerful architect, which brought his notions to these countries, but he was living there. he was designing there, and it was polemical. The newspaper, the Grossman's writings show how polemic it was in France. It's the same thing in Israel, in Haifa. It's like it is a presence that has to be acknowledged, and it is a process that differs very much from these more recent approaches from what we call these worldwide offices. I had the opportunity when I was an architectural reporter to interview Frank Garrett for the Louis Vuitton in Paris. And he said, we are doing it in Belgium, in China, in US, and we're designing it in Paris from a joint office, for a joint venture from many parts of the world. And you have a topical approach on those practices. We see during the 90s how Koolhaas used it to brag that he was doing meetings in airport rooms because he was always flying. I think that when I refer to transit, I am still, me and of course my research team, we are referring to something that it's a phenomena that may loom on these international architects, but it was something different. Papers could not travel so easily, and then the ideas couldn't travel so easily as well. So I don't want to say that there is no quality position that we can attribute to this experience made by Niemeyer. I am not a man that's here to defend him. I don't think of him that way. But I really think that it is slightly different. A very good, I'm talking too much, but the intelligence officers in Brazil used to follow his footsteps internationally because he could be connecting with communists. They were like following his traces. So, which is like a small sign that he was connecting. He was there. He had this, and it was a broader sense than only doing a building for this or that person, I think.
Okay, thank you. I have something else concerning this, but maybe we come back to it in a minute. Would anyone else from the panel comment on this? I think we have a question here from Leandro.
I can say something and point of what my colleagues have said. I think that because change is happening so fast in economic, political, social, I think that the narratives that we've inherited and the sort of the perceptions in a way now have this kind of are going like with three vectors are going very rapid. So it's just like getting very, very quick, like the way in which we need to change or adapt our narratives and the perceptions that we've received. It's also globality, like there's and connectivity between all parts of the world, and that all influence, like everything can influence the others. But also, and I think that today also this is becoming a thing because there's like the power is much more distributed along stakeholders, I think probably in all realms. And so I think that in this, and especially when we're talking about architecture and the design discipline, there is, there's because architecture stays and everything else sort of goes and is in transit. I think that there's a special need, and I think this is also, this panel talked about this a lot, about how can we adapt to this, all these changes, how can we be there with the rest of society, or at least bring the knowledge and bring the understanding to it.
Thank you, Adriana. Let me now read, picking up on the last question, Rafael. So Leandro Medrano, a professor from the University of São Paulo, wrote, "The modern housing developments sought to represent modernity as a whole. Your interesting presentation reveals significant changes in these buildings, which go beyond form. As you have shown, the process and narratives are different, but the spatial constructions are also social constructions, according to Lefebvre, for example. In this sense, does your research identify any vector of social transformation in these formal transformations?"
to Adriana.
I think.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I was like, okay, I could answer that, but if whoever wants to get for that, yes, absolutely. Of course, all these architectures, all these districts were built for nuclear families, the post-war. We're not that society anymore. And so, yes, we are witnessing how, for example, the original residents are disappearing. And so it's also a question now, many districts are half empty. And so who comes in? And that's a very important question. The way that the research is addressed, it's basically, understanding how the space changes, or we can change it, but also like making sure that that this is not a renewal project where people get evicted. But of course, there's the regional residents are just disappearing. So this is a question, and the demographics are changing, and they're, for example, you can go into Japan, where the danchis, and they have this problem. Okay, no, there's this aged population that are living alone or are dying alone, and they're trying to figure out how to shift the perceptions of the young generation, is to say, okay, I'm going to live in a danchi, and this is going to be super cool. And they're pairing, like, there are many strategies, because the bottom line here is that, yes, we are not anymore that like the nuclear family is not the unique model of the household structures.
Thank you, Adriana. I just wanted to pick up on this, and I wanted to ask you, before we go to the next question, Malisi, which I already noted. Your studies lead us in your presentation in terms of reconceptualizing the housing typology, right? And what it can be and how it can adapt. Specifically in a moment when Lacaton and Vassal win the Pritzker Prize. And my question to you, and you could maybe comment very briefly, is does it seem for you that we have a new comprehension towards housing? One that could debate or collide directly with a very consolidated model that we had before. You show a very clear image of what that can be, right? Through strategic thinking.
Yes, I think if I understood it correctly, there's so what does it mean, not in like as a housing system in the cities? Could that be the question? So yes, of course, I think that this is interesting in a way, because first it's like this work is sort of working within the system, but trying to sort of go against the major sort of lens or fashion of just like gentrification, evicting people out of because the easiest way, and these are big territories now well positioned within the cities, is to just like, demolish them, tear them down, and create something new, like a real estate operation, and bring wealthier tenants. So these are renegotiating, and this is what this research understand, is that these are territories of opportunity for keeping the original residents there, and trying to keep affordable housing, because of course these are not expensive places right now in the city, so to maintain that, and this is what these adaptations are trying to do. And of course there are also many others that it's just a retrofitting, but it's a private thing that go for new people, so this is kind of the in-between and the nitty-gritty of these processes. And the good thing, the positive aspect, but it's not, of course, it's not always happening, but what this research looks into is how can we sort of boost that, to try to, within the housing systems that are already very problematic, try to maintain affordable housing, and try to keep the people in their places.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have a question from Alicia Queiroz, very important question. She says, should a first decolonial discussion involve the acquisition of the collection, perhaps more than the curatorial or architectural decisions? find out whether the acquisition comes from exploitation or fair acquisition. Charlie, Sadi, maybe this is for you.
Yes, I can see.
Maybe I can complete on your paper. You make a very, very clear description on the logics of the curatorial work and the design work. So maybe you can develop a little bit further on those.
Yeah, I think like I mean, for me, it's this is a fair question to ask, and then I think like the layering of this paper also is just like builds up on that ideas, like, you know, what do you acquire, like how do you take it yourself, then how do you keep it, and how do you give it to someone else to present, and then how these guys are like using this to promote themselves. So it's just like a steps of ownership in like looking at these objects. And then I think for me it's like obviously we can have like many discussions about this, but I specifically wanted to look at that, what is this university museum, and then how is this becoming something, like, because it's just kind of dangerous, I believe, because the objects are kind of in the end ending up in places that they are not appreciated, and they cannot be, because they're just like next to each other, and then they just lose value, and then what's the point of all this journey and the process? So yeah, like it's a layered, it's like it's complicated, I believe, but I assume that that's a fair question to ask, like, you know, how do you even just understand the value of these things, and then how it's sourced? So yeah, like more questions and discussions can be done on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Jesus, I wanted to pick up on something that shows up on your paper, but also was discussed on the very first panel of our conference today. So your paper is very curious, and it manages to unsettle, I think, some established concepts in architecture, just like I think Adriana Pablos also works in that way. So earlier we saw the competition for Shinken Driku, well, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, district in 1996 in Japan, so curated or directed by Sejima, as a possibility, using the platform of a competition, an architectural competition, as a possibility to advance in design and in the discussion can be. So my question to you is in regards to what you bring about with this analysis, which pretty much connects to the digital on a completely new way, also trying to engage with the logics of the Bitcoins, right? And the marketplace online. Which advances, if you could one highlight in a very simple way? So I think this is something that I really wanted to get out of what you brought with your presentation. So could you maybe advance?
Nice question, because I think that in the Guggenheim competition it was not possible, because Roy Conrad was thinking about digital space, tried to justify all the proposals, but in fact all of them were really iconic, and he tried again to identify all of them with ideas, with these anonymous processes. But when he discovered that the digital space must be introduced in a must be thought as an exhibition at the space, which can be produced by the technology, and it has the format of the information in order to be close to this fluidity, this flexibility that characterize this reflection. So I think the Guggenheim competition for Helsinki was not an example for that, because on the one hand we could discover the physical proposal. They were not built, but it were thought in order to be built. And on the other hand, we have to take into account that all of the information belongs to the same level, because Troy Conrad tried to get all this information, which were projects, but they weren't physical, and in order to connect all of them through digital technology. And I could also like to say another thing about the institution, the reflection you did at the beginning of the panel, and I agree with Jael, because I think that the Guggenheim Foundation did something similar. I mean, there is a different point of view when they faced the problem to build a museum in Europe or in the US, and there is another point of view when they go to the Abu Dhabi coast and these other cities with those problems about labor and labor conditions. Indeed, in the Guggenheim competition, there was an alternative competition which was called Dines Helsinki, and it was directed by Troy Conrad, by Michael Sorkin and Karin Tepal and Juhani Palasma, and they wanted to rethink the idea of museum in a different way from the Guggenheim idea of museum. So these two perspectives are also in common in different global institutions such as Guggenheim and Louvre. So I agree with her.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Otherwise, I would just pick back on another topic. So maybe I go there so we can use our time. Rafael, you mentioned before a work by Vanessa Grossman. So in Paris in exile, at a later moment than that moment that you describe on your paper, Niemeyer worked at two fronts, as they say in the book. So one, in connection with the left wing, he built public architecture at the same time that he realized projects in other directions, such as the houses in Côte d'Azur, a story that Vanessa Grossman co-authors in the book. Also Niemeyer in France, A Creative Exile, a free translation from French. Can you comment on the relevance of this political and ideological inclinement at a previous moment? So you briefly speak about this on your presentation with the temporal scope of your research. So maybe 2 decades before, how did it develop, or how did it work in terms of arranging projects for Niemeyer, besides what you call, I think, the projects that had the idea of democratized architecture or something? It's not the precise term you use, but so did his ideological inclination play a role in generating projects at that point, before in the relationship with the United States and not France?
Well, I'm a bit uncomfortable in giving a proper answer to this question, because right now the book wrote by Vanessa, the one I brought, is probably in a boat, and it's not a good time to ship things by boat right now because of all this Suez thing. So I don't know. What I did read was Le PCF a changé, the one, the small one with the airplane. Yes, and this one is really quintessential for me. It's one of these monographies that I keep with me. But I should answered your question, not escaping from the polemics it underlines. I must say that my first skepticism is to know is the word exile, but I can't say because I still couldn't get my hands on the book. And unfortunately, Vanessa is not here. The time zone is a bit uncomfortable. But I can say that I really think that the ideological positions of Oscar Niemeyer, or who he worked with, really determined the way he used to position himself politically. He was a communist, but he was mostly a foreign communist. The same way that he was a communist in Brazil for the army during dictatorship, but he was also an internationally renowned architect who had those ideological positions. It's like the notion of his left-wing commitment, which was never denied, and he never took a step back on it, never stopped him from working from all the range of political position. This is something we can discuss in itself, but to me, this is not what I'd say in a degree of studies. I wouldn't assert that. But it sounds to me that the way he works within and without, from inside and from outside the country, from one situation to another, the way he's always traveling, the way he's always wandering through this 20th century, makes of him something like a person that can escape from this question. And moreover, what really strikes me is how his authority in Brazil, his homeland, is very well kept. It's like during our researches on IFAN's archives for the Pampulha's restoration, something that Gabriel Romero did along with me in Rio de Janeiro back when we could visit Rio. And it shows that there are letters from everyone: Carlos Drummond de Andrade, from Juscelino, from Lúcio Costa, from Silva Vasconcelos, but there are no letters from Niemeyer. He's always a third party on the letters. I spoke to Oscar. He doesn't want to do it like this. I spoke to Oscar. He could accept that. And he's like this looming authority, which can only be built by the way that he wasn't there. He was abroad, just like Rossetti's writing for Rita Marati's construction, like Milton Ramos is having a hard time to make decisions that could overlap his degree as collaborating architect and even eventually become something of an author himself. And Niemeyer is out. He's writing. His authority is indisputable, not only because he is this hero architect that historiography has enthroned him in his lifetime, but also because he was absent. So I think that his political positions are really important, but what really strikes me is his wandering, is the way he's always on the move, in transit, really. And this sounds to me a factor that is usually overlooked when we try to define why he was such a successful architect to this degree of recognition.
Okay.
I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's a big discussion. I look forward to seeing what you guys are going to find out in your research in the coming years. I know it's a huge amount of work to try to find out what that means. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you all for being with us, for engaging into the questions, for answering the questions. This has been a very ambitious, I think, discussion, and the way we put these projects together. It also brings about lots of incipient discussions, which are also very interesting. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope it was inspiring for you, for your own discussions, for your own researches. That's it. So we will have now a 30-minute break. It's been a long day, but now we will have Mr. Gareth Doherty's keynote in a couple of minutes. So I would like to invite you all for the keynote, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.